Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this event with Anne Applebaum. Anne, I'm sure everybody knows, is a prolific and wonderful author who's written some wonderful books. Gulag, Red Famine, which was about Ukraine and the famine there in the searches. And then, of course, her great book on Iron Curtain. I have to say, Anne, I've read all three of them and enjoyed them, of course, and bought them, by the way, as well. Anne is currently, if I get it right, Anne, you're now working for The Atlantic magazine, but you've been a journalist all your life, both in Britain, Poland, and no doubt here in the UK. And I should also point out, and you know this, but I'm bound to say it as an LSE patriot, you've had a long association with the London School of Economics. You did your master's here, I believe, in international relations. You also, we were privileged enough in LSE Ideas to have you as the Philip Ramon Professor, amongst several wonderful professors, as you know, but it was wonderful to have you. And then you were associated with the Institute of Global Affairs. So a long and productive and great relationship between yourself and the school. And of course, inevitably, a strong connection because of your writings with Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and of course, Poland, where I think you're now based, in your house, of course. What I was going to do, Anne, just to allow you time to reflect on your book, Twilight of Democracy, the failure of politics and the parting of friends, just to ask you why you wrote it, what's in it, and what you think it says that is important. So I'll give you as many minutes as you want to, Anne, to outline your thoughts. But again, welcome to the LSE. I'm sorry about some of the technical problems we had, and over to you. Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. I very much appreciate it. And yes, I do have a long affiliation with the LSE, and I'm delighted to be part of this event. I am sorry for the technical problems. You know, everybody has their own way of doing an event, and this one was one I wasn't used to, so I'm sorry for that. I mean, as Mick just said, this book is quite different from my previous book. So if in the past, the three big books I've published over the last years, not counting my cookbook, but three books I published over the last few years, you know, these were projects that required a number of years of research. They were based on archives. They were, you know, interviews. They attempted to reflect the experience of a lot of people. I usually tried to show an event from a number of perspectives. So when I wrote my book about the Gulag, for example, I show the points of view of the guards as well as the prisoners. You know, I try to explain what it was that Stalin said he was doing. This book, this new book, is really almost the opposite of that. It is a very subjective book. It is written partly in the first person. It involves people that I know and events that I lived through. I did do some reporting for it. I did interview people, and I did a lot of background reading. And it really is my experience of living through what seemed to me an important historical and political change. To be clear, it's not a political science text. And for those LSE graduates who want it to have kind of, you know, a one-line takeaway from this conversation and from the book, I'm afraid it will disappoint you. As I said, it's a reflection on events. I am part of the events. I'm a kind of figure in the story, and therefore I couldn't write it as an objective historian. But I also, partly because it's subjective, I allowed myself to, you know, use a lot of nuance. You know, I don't claim to have a single explanation. And what the book is really about is the end of a particular political coalition that played an important role in politics in the United States, in Western Europe, and in Central Europe. And the book particularly looks closely at the United States, the UK, and Poland. And this unscientific grouping is because those are three countries that I have a close association with. Also, they weirdly have had a similar, there are weird ways in which they are similar. And the coalition that I'm looking at is the coalition of what you might roughly call center-right anti-communists who came together in the 1980s and early 1990s to push for the end of communism under the banner of Reaganism or Thatcherism, or in Eastern Europe, in Poland, it's under the Solidarity movement, or the other dissident and anti-communist movements in the region, and who created a kind of anti-communist coalition that, roughly speaking, shared a lot of the same ideas for that period of time, and which I felt myself very happy to be part of. I mean, in retrospect, and we knew this at the time, but the importance of it wasn't clear. But in retrospect, those coalitions, both within each country and also across the West, had different components. So there were people who were anti-communists, in the United States or Britain because they cared about, realpolitik and Russian nuclear weapons. There were people who were in that camp because they cared about democracy and human rights. There were people who were in that camp because they were Christians and because communism was an atheist ideology. And the same is true in Poland. There were center-left anti-communists, there were center-right anti-communists. And they all had slightly different reasons for being in that camp, but nevertheless, they were able all to work, with one another towards a set of goals. And actually, those coalitions held together in the 1990s as well. And the general, the assumption that we were all on one side, that what we all want is, for example, in Poland, is an integrated Poland connected to the rest of Europe, a democratic Poland, a free market Poland, although markets weren't the main issue in this group that I'm describing. This seemed to be a kind of shared assumption of a lot of people. And I should say, I start my book with a party that I gave on New Year's Eve in 1999. And just to be clear, it's not a book about parties, and I'm not a great hostess, and it wasn't a fancy party. It's just that was a metaphor for this coalition because a lot of its members were there. Thinking back on that party 20 years later, I realized that a lot of people who had been there were no longer people I felt myself to have anything in common with politically at all. And in fact, some of them had attacked me in public or had become part of a very different political grouping, a radical right grouping that is very explicitly anti-democratic in some ways, that has sought to break the Polish constitution. This is the ruling party in Poland now, to pack the courts, to make public media into state media and specifically into political party media, and had sought to change damage the idea that there would be an even playing field in politics and try and rewrite the rules so that it would win. And the party has done so using a very virulent form of kind of propaganda and identity politics that seek to organize their half of Poland around an idea of kind of traditional idea, around an idea about Polish history, and also in part around a conspiracy theory that we can maybe talk about a little bit later. And as I realized how different how the degree to which this coalition had broke up, I thought, well, it might be interesting to explore why this has happened. And as I began to think about it, I realized that it had happened in more than one place. There's a very similar, very deep split in what used to be the Republican Party, certainly among conservative intellectuals. There are now some who are very pro-Trump, and there are some who are very anti-Trump. Indeed, there are now some who are working to make sure that Trump loses, ex-Republicans or never Trumper Republicans. Inside the UK, the sort of united conservative movement of the 1990s is also broken up, with some of its members virulently opposed to Brexit and some very much in favor. And so the question was, what were the things that had happened? Where had the changes come from? Why had these coalitions broke up? And again, I repeat, there isn't a single answer or a single explanation. In some cases, you can look at people's careers. We always talk about ideas, and this is a fault of political philosophers. And we always talk about ideas as if they exist in some kind of abstract space, where, I don't know, conservatism and liberalism and communism are somehow fighting one another in some kind of, I don't know, stratosphere where, these ideas exist as, I don't know, helium balloons or something clashing against one another. In fact, ideas are always attached to people, and they're always attached to political movements. And people have reasons why they choose one idea over the next. And so the book explores some of the careers of people who made those decisions. The book also looks at some of the reasons why conservatives might have become disappointed with the world in the 1990s and later in the 2000s in particular. And what was it about the post-communist or post-Cold War era that they found insufficiently compelling, insufficiently bold, insufficiently cutting edge, and how and also how some of them began to feel that their own societies were becoming degenerate or changing in ways that they didn't like. And this engendered a genuine, in some cases, deeply felt pessimism. And the phrase I use is one, cultural despair, which is a phrase invented by a historian of Germany called Fritz Stern, who was writing about 19th century Germany, where he finds a very similar phenomenon, where in rapidly modernizing societies, people begin to feel that things have been lost. And I don't question, by the way, the genuineness of this feeling, but it was encouraged and promoted, and then again used in politics by people who wanted to use this sense of loss to do politics. The book does talk about some people who were my friends or some people who I've met. It is not primarily a book about friendship, but it's a book about how and why people change their minds. The point of writing it was partly, it was selfish. It was for me to, it reflects a genuine effort of me on my part to try and understand what had happened. But also I think I wrote it as a kind of warning to people who care about democracy, because up until the present, many of us have had, there was, particularly in the 90s actually, but it even became worse later. There has been a kind of feeling of inevitability about democracy, that our systems are so great and so stable that they will just stay this way, and that we don't have to do anything in particular. We don't have to worry about reforming them or changing them. They will just somehow, they will somehow always fix themselves because they always have, and we can all go about our business and go and make money, or, I don't know, write articles, or garden in our gardens, and we won't have to do anything in particular to stop anti-democratic or in some cases nationalist forces from changing the nature of our societies and our states. And the book is a warning that that's not true, that that democracy has always been fragile, and most of the great thinkers about democracy, including the founders of the United States and the authors of the American Constitution, were very conscious of this. They wrote a constitution which was, in which they all had at the back of their heads the example of ancient Rome and the collapse of the Roman Republic. And they all had in their minds the idea that there could be a demagogue who could rise to power. And they all understood the fragility of human nature and the appeal of authoritarian ideas. And they wrote the Constitution with those things in mind. So the book does ask people to look again and to think harder about whether our systems are inevitable, and whether we can, what safeguards and what warnings we can take, and what changes we might need to make in order to preserve them. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Anne. That was very clear. Can I pick up on a few things? I've obviously read the book and much enjoyed it. The slogan of the LSE is always looking for the causes of things, which is not a terribly original thing, but that's our kind of motto. What do you think is the basic cause or causes of this crisis? Because we go back to 1989, which you do and I do. We go back to the liberal, optimistic 90s. We look where we are today. We have to ask ourselves, surely, where do you think this has come from? Now, I noticed in your book, and I'll be very brief with this question, you say, well, there may be economic factors, clearly. The obvious one is clearly globalization. Immigration is also part of, I suppose, an economic question. But you think it's more than that, don't you, really? Deep down, I think you do feel that the economics are not unimportant in all this, but there's something else going on. What do you think it is else going on that is causing the crisis that you're discussing in your book?
So to be clear, the people who I'm talking about in my book are not victims of globalization. They are not people who have been impoverished or impoverished by immigration or have lost out because of economic changes. So these are all elites, essentially. They are people who are, were part of one elite and now they're part of a different elite. And so although this is not a book about why people vote for Trump, or why people voted for Brexit. That's not because I'm not interested in those issues. It's because, there are a lot of other people who've written about them. Even I've written about them. And the book is about something narrow or more specific, which is why intellectuals change their minds and switch sides. But you are right that that there is something else going on. And this is something I've felt for a long time, which is that the change in the nature of political information, and all information for that matter, and the way in which we get and process information about the world has changed really profoundly in the last decade. And it's changed in ways that I don't think we've even really understood yet. I mean, and this ranges from the nature of how we see news and information, and the lack of, the absence now of hierarchy. So how do we get information? We get it on our phones, and the phone says, you get something about, an advertisement for hairspray, and then you get a Facebook message from your cousin, and then you get a notice about China oppressing the Muslim minority in Xinjiang and mass murder in Syria. And these things come jumbled together. We see them in rapid succession. There's no hierarchy of importance. And so people have developed much more distance from politics, because politics has become part of a vast world of sort of entertainment and advertising that is somehow distant from us. It's not, this information about it comes in these different packages. At the same time, many people now get information, and in particular, journalists often get information from forms of media that emphasize and favor items of news or information that have a lot of emotion attached to them. So famously, the Facebook algorithm favors the things that move fastest through Facebook are the things that make people angriest, because those are the things that keep people on the screen longest, and that's how the algorithm works. Same thing, the same principle works in Twitter, that it's the controversy that that everybody sees, and the emotion that everybody sees, and that has also changed politics. That means that if you want to reach people, you now need to. You need to speak in a much higher level. You need to shout if you want to be heard among all the kind of noise that's an emotion that's around us. And I refer in the book to the work of a kind of behavioral psychologist called Karen Stenner, who has done fascinating work, and again, it's explained a little bit in the book, on the effect of shouting, really, or cacophony, or loud contradictory noise and argument on people. And it turns out that there is some part of the population that doesn't like it, that is bothered by harsh disagreement, that is bothered by deep divisions, and that responds to them by sort of wanting everything to go silent, and wanting to block it out, and favoring leaders or parties who promise to bring back some kind of stability and silence and order. So we have a sort of group of people who are bothered by this kind of politics, and we also have a group of people, some of them my ex-acquaintances, who have learned to reach exactly that group. The way political messaging now works, if once upon a time political parties spoke to to everybody, and they gave mass messaging, mass marketing was the way of doing politics. Now politics is much more retail, and you can speak differently to different audiences. There's a part of the political right found a way to identify and speak to audiences who are bothered by modern cacophony, who long for and miss a quieter and more traditional society, even if it's one that they just imagine or read about. And for people who feel this loss, this sense that modernity has somehow has left things behind. And new political coalitions were formed around people who had those kinds of feelings.
You talk in the book about nostalgia, which I found very moving and very interesting and very true. Let me just move the argument or ask the question. You've outlined many problems. Historians are not supposed to draw analogies, are we? But we always do. How dangerous is this to democracy? I mean, because the obvious parallel we always would tend to make with any current crisis is always with the 30s, 20s and the 30s. Is it as bad as that? Is it as dangerous as that? And are the threats to democracy, which you talk about in your book, are they as great as they were back then? Or is that a comparison we shouldn't even be thinking about? We should simply be saying, look, we face this challenge. It's a challenge today. Making parallels with the past doesn't help very much.
So the trouble with the 30s is that we all know how it ended, and because it ended in a mass bloodbath, the comparison to the 30s is always a little tricky, because I am not, nobody is saying that there is a mass bloodbath going on. You can usefully look at the beginning of the 30s or the end of the 20s and see some parallels to the present moment, and I think that's what often upsets people. The writer Timothy Snyder has done made very interesting comparisons between the present and that era in some of the things that he's written. I have a slightly, I always ask the question, because I don't believe history does repeat itself. I mean, history kind of rhymes but doesn't repeat. You can find echoes from the past without direct repetition. And I wonder whether what we're seeing now won't play itself out in a different way. In other words, if once upon a time, dictators felt that they needed to control crowds on the street by having teams of, brown shirts or black shirts, guys with sticks who would come and beat people up and smash things. If politics now doesn't take place on the street, which it doesn't much anymore, then maybe the thing that we should be more worried about are the Twitter mobs that can be organized, real Twitter mobs or fake ones, actually, as the case may be, to promote or put down different kinds of voices and arguments. Maybe some of the phenomenon that we saw in the past are now going to take place online and in a different way. Really interesting and strange moment is now unfolding in the United States, where we have protests in Portland that did become violent and unruly. And although, everybody in Britain should know this better than anybody, years and decades of experience tell you that when you have a violent and unruly protest, what you should do is community policing, negotiation. You should try and bring people together, or you should try and calm the situation down, try and get people to go home. The Trump administration did almost exactly the opposite of this. And they sent into Portland a team of poorly marked, men wearing poorly marked camouflage uniforms, carrying heavy weaponry. And they sent them in to violently push back against the protesters. In a move almost guaranteed to make the situation worse and to make people angry and to make the violence worse. And so the question is, why would they do that? Why worsen the situation? Leaving aside, by the way, the fact that it's unclear whether this is even constitutional, whether the US government is allowed to do this or not. And it breaks all kinds of precedents about the relationship between the federal government and the states. The troops being used are customs troops. They haven't been used inside American cities before. It's all kinds of other things that are wrong with this. But why are they doing it? And the only explanation I could come up with was that they want to use the pictures. In other words, the pictures of the men in camouflage carrying weapons, putting down the protesters or beating them up they're being used on Fox News, and then they will be used in Trump's campaign advertising. In fact, it started already, as evidence that the president is dominating the streets, that he's putting down these leftist, fascist, whatever term you want, mobs, that he's taking control of the situation. And this is a kind of almost performative authoritarianism. In other words, the images are being used to inspire and unify that part of the population that is bothered by, is afraid, is afraid for its safety and is worried by what's going on. And so it's almost as if we have some of the, some of the same ideas from the past, but in the internet era, in a time when people get their politics from television and from social media, different tactics are being used. So I'm not sure we're talking about a repeat of the 30s, but
Sure.
But I would say one other thing I would
Sure.
say is that the threat to democracy, in other words, that we might wind up with political systems that are unjust or repressive, is very real. I don't think Hungary is a democracy anymore. I don't think an opposition party can win a national election in Hungary. The media is too firmly under the thumb of the government. The courts are too firmly under the thumb of the government. The government has too many tools now in its arsenal, the government and the ruling party, I should say, that it can prevent anybody else from creating the coalitions needed to gain power. While it's not that bad in Poland yet. It could be. It's not impossible that after 3 more years we will have that. And we see clearly, again, in the US, we see that the Republican Party is not averse to using the tactics of voter suppression or gerrymandering or other, anti-democratic tricks in order to stay in power. It knows that it's a party of the minority now, and so the only way it can win elections, is by cheating. And so we are already in a stage in several important democracies. They're not all big democracies, but they have, where it's not, will there be a fair election has become a real and genuine question.
One of our questions, which comes from a colleague, Graham, he quotes Brian Class, who's an old friend of mine, now teaches at University College London. It's
friend of mine too.
Yeah, we both know Brian very well. Excellent guy. But he raises the point about the election. Now, you kind of run against what has now become the norm to say, well, Trump is likely to lose it. You kind of say, well, he could win it on a law and order platform by exploiting the whole question of law and order, very much as did Nixon back in '68, of course, which does bring an interesting parallel. But Brian raises the interesting point about what's going to happen if or when, just for the moment, hypothetically, he does lose it. Do we then get to a point where he simply throws up his hand and say, fair dues, fair cop, I've lost? Isn't the worry, and this goes to the heart of democracy, will he accept a result? This is hypothetical, of course. Will he accept a result which goes against him? And if he doesn't, what then are going to be the consequences? What's your kind of forward thinking on that, Anne?
So he's been telling us that he might not accept the result. He's been asked directly, will you accept the result? And he has said, I will see. What happens then is right now the subject of a lot of, believe me, a lot of off the record and other conversations not just among Democrats, but among some Republicans who are worried about what the impact on the country would be if he lost and refused to hand over. I mean, I think ultimately it will depend a lot on how the rest of his party reacts, what kind of support he gets, whether Fox News stands by him in his attempt to steal the election. That will all shape the result. I mean, I think Biden has said, there is a provision in the Constitution for this. I mean, if he loses and if on January 20th he's still in the White House, then Biden can get the Secret Service to escort him out. I mean, so there is, we would assume that if it came to that, the problem could be solved. But the really important question also is how, to what degree has Trump transformed his party, and to what extent is the Republican Party now a party which is a rogue party? It's no longer a party that wants to participate fairly in a democracy. And my guess is that most Republicans would not want to see themselves that way. They would not want to. They would not want to identify themselves as part of an anti-democratic political movement. I'm sure there's a minority who would, but most wouldn't. And I would think that the lack of public support would also help stop that. But I mean, the questioner is absolutely right. I mean, it's a real problem to worry about. We should worry about cheating in the election. We should worry about attempts to impact the result, and then we should worry about what Trump and the Trumpists will do when they lose.
Yeah, that's one last question, Anne, because you worked in Britain for a long time. Indeed, you worked on the Spectator, I know, for a long time. How have your friends on the Spectator responded to your book? Just as you don't need to answer that if you don't feel like answering it, but
Oh, I can answer it. I mean,
no, fine. I didn't want to set you up, but I just thought, because I mean, you do say some things about Boris Johnson, obviously, and I'm sure he knows about that. What? How do you?
I hope he doesn't have time to read my book. That's all I'm saying. I wouldn't expect him to have
No,
done.
but he's been told about it, I'm sure.
I don't know. I hope not. I hope he's got something else to do.
Yeah.
So no, I've had a mixed reaction. So I had a bad review in the Spectator, although it's by someone whom I do not know or do not know well. I've met.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
Which I found oddly tribal. I mean, it felt like it reminded me a little bit of the far left reviews that I got of Gulag when it came out in 2004. The sort of, you've offended our tribe and therefore we have to undermine you. It felt that's what that review felt like. But I have heard privately from a couple of people, including a former editor of The Spectator and even the current editor of The Spectator, who've written to me saying they've enjoyed the book, or anyway, they've enjoyed parts of it. And I think I tried to also reflect what was the charm and appeal of the magazine and of the people around it in the 1990s, the time when I worked there. And the, even how much fun it was to be there. And I'm not there anymore and haven't been for a long time, but, and I remain in, very good relationships with many of them, including, some who are Brexiteers. So, so I haven't found that to be a kind of relationship breaking problem. But yeah, it's interesting. I have yet to have a review from the kind of Brexiteer right that I thought was interesting. I have heard from a lot of Tories or people on the, including, I mean, I did an event last night with Matt D'Ancona, who one would have described as a Tory journalist at that time, who felt exactly the same way I do about a lot of things. So, sort of, a lot of the reaction to the book will depend on, what journey you made in the last 2 decades.
And also whether they've read the book properly, which is always...
whether they've read it, or were interested in or cared about the argument, or were just, annoyed by it. I mean, look, as I said, it's a very personal, subjective book. There are things in it that will annoy people. It's a kind of, it doesn't reflect a consensus. It reflects my...
Was it a difficult book to write, Anne? Sorry to interrupt you. Was it a difficult book to write, do you think, because of the personal side?
So in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I mean, compared to writing Gulag that took 10 years, no, and actually some of the pieces of it that flowed the most were the bits where I was describing something that I remembered, because, it comes directly from your head. I think the hard part for me and the sort of real struggle was in the analysis and in pulling it together so that it became a book, because I found that I had such conflicting and mixed feelings about the past events that I found it, one of the things I wanted the book to be was sort of nuanced. I didn't want it to have a kind of banging, it's not a denunciation of anybody, I don't think, maybe one or two people, but I wanted it to reflect my mixed feelings and some of my nuanced feelings about people who I've known and events that I lived through. So in that sense, it was hard. There was a lot of sort of lying on the floor with my eyes closed, thinking, okay, what do I really think about this? What do I really remember? So in that sense, it was more difficult. By the way, I should say it's not a memoir. It has bits. No,
I got that. No, it's definitely not
about my life.
You end up fairly pessimistically at the end, I felt, Anne. Your analysis, I thought, concluded with a will you, my generation, our generation, really, wherever we ended up politically, whether on the left or the right, doesn't really matter. Our generation will maybe one day be rendered irrelevant because the kind of discourses and arguments that we used to have, at least we could have them. I think what you say in the book is that the possibility of discourse is becoming even more difficult today.
Yeah, so I try to end it actually not on an entirely pessimistic note, because I feel that it's irresponsible to be pessimistic. You can't do that to to young people, to the kinds of people that you teach or I've taught or my children's generation. I mean, it's unfair to them to say everything's over and finished. The feeling that I wanted to leave people with was the feeling of radical possibility.
Mm.
Look, there is no inevitability about history. There is no inevitable. It is not. Written in blood somewhere that America will always be a democracy or Britain will always be a democracy. These are things that can change and can be.
Mm.
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that democracy always dies or that it will have to,
Mm.
be extinct within our lifetimes.
Mm.
That these are things that can be prevented. There aren't any rules to history. It doesn't
Mm.
have a, there isn't a kind of, upward progress and everything always get better. No, history zigzags like that or goes in
Mm.
circles. And it's up to us to make sure that that our countries go in the direction that we want them to go.
Yeah, and it's up to us as well as to the younger generation. Now, I've got a lot of questions come through, and we've had a very large number of participants in this, which is great. I'll ask one question, which gets us back really to the in a sense, the elephant in the room, which we so far not mentioned, which is COVID-19. What impact do you think this is having on this on your book? You do mention it in the book, I see. I think it's there. Is this going to make things a lot worse? Is it going to encourage further decline of debate, or do you think that it may also have some kind of silver lining? What do you think on the COVID question? I'm bound to come in with that one first because that's what a lot of people are asking about.
So the COVID-19, first of all, it's a difficult question to answer because I feel that it's a dynamic situation, and some things that seemed to be happening 3 months ago have changed a lot since then, and a lot depends on how the virus progresses and changes. I mean, so for example, at the beginning of the crisis, it looked very much like a moment that was going to be good for authoritarianism. It was a, the people throughout human history, whenever people are frightened and afraid for their lives, then they are willing to sacrifice freedom for safety. And this is, you can go back to the history of any plague or any disaster, and you can see this to be the case. And very often it's also been true in history that restrictions on people's movement that have been laid down in a time of illness or crisis or plague or emergency very often last after that. And so that moment when people were staying home and people were being, in some European countries were being arrested for being out on the street or fined, and borders were slamming shut, this looked like it was going to be a really good moment for authoritarians. And I should say that there are some countries, some people, in Central Asia and elsewhere, where absolutely the dictatorships have been entrenched by the need to keep the border shut, keep people under control, and so on. At the same time, one of the dynamic ways in which the virus has surprised people is the way it's also turned out to be true that it turns out that this particular public health crisis is one that is best fought by a government that enjoys a lot of trust, and by a country where science enjoys a certain amount of respect, where fact-based media are the most important media that most people read and listen to. And it also has turned out that certain kinds of, they're sometimes called populists, or anti-pluralist, or leaders, including Donald Trump, but also the president of Brazil, have navigated this crisis very badly, because these are people who are used to being able to use conspiracy theory and conspiracy thinking in order to cover up and disguise and massage what they do. And this crisis has made that impossible, and because it depends on, it requires a lot of social cohesion. It requires people to, follow instructions and also to care about one another. And in deeply polarized societies, and it is the deeply polarized societies who produce these very, these populist would-be autocratic leaders, that has proven to be impossible. A lot of people have noticed how well countries run by women are doing. There's this sort of story that gets written every few weeks about Angela Merkel and New Zealand, and a few others. It's occurred to me that actually the people are looking at that the other way around. It's almost like the kind of countries who would elect a woman leader were already the kinds of countries where there's a lot of social consensus and fact-based, evidence-based media. There's a there may be something to that that goes the other way around, because that turns out to be one of the things that has helped people survive the crisis. It's also turned out, interestingly, that the real divide between who's done well and who's done badly, at least so far, and remember this can develop differently over the next year, so far has not been between democracy and autocracy. The division has been between countries that have effected, trusted bureaucries and those that don't. And the countries that have done really well include Germany, they include Switzerland, they include Taiwan and South Korea, Japan, several of the Central European countries have done particularly well, Slovakia, Czech Republic. And so those factors have turned out to be much more important than whether a given, than the actual nature of the political system. And some autocracies have done quite badly. I mean, Russia hasn't done very well.
Although to add a little point in there, I think both Vietnam and Cuba have done quite well as well.
No, I'm saying the difference is not autocracy, democracy.
Absolutely.
The difference is to do with the nature of the bureaucracy and the public health system.
Yeah, absolutely right. I've got a question here which brings us back to Poland, Anne, where I think you're now living, obviously, about the relationship of Poland to the EU and how well you think the EU has done through the current crisis and the current relationship between the EU and Poland, because that also goes to the heart of some of your book as well. Could you illuminate on that, please?
Sure. I mean, it's not a book about the EU, but I'm happy to.
Sure.
So it is a very difficult situation for the EU. Whereas Hungary is a very small country, Poland is a very large and important, significant country. And it's also one that's deeply divided. So almost 50-50 between people who approve and don't approve of the government. And so the EU is in a difficult position of how to cope with the anti-democratic and in some instances anti-European language and behavior of Poland. I mean, should the whole country be punished because of the nature of the current government? Should it be punished using the EU's financial mechanisms? Is that the right way to do it? There's a big argument going on, believe me, inside Europe about that right now. I do think that it is possible, and Poland has a particular, because of the courts, the judicial issue, this crisis might come to a head sooner than people think, because the EU, if it is an empire of anything, it is an empire of regulation, and EU countries depend on one another's courts to enforce laws and to enforce the rules of the single market. And if people begin to conclude that Polish courts are politicized and their verdicts can't be trusted, that is going to cause a crisis probably sooner rather than later. And it will be sparked or provoked by some case that is resolved in a way that people find unsatisfactory. And then you could find Poland somehow blocked or barred from certain, I'm not exactly sure what mechanisms this would follow, but would find it, if EU law can't be enforced in Poland, then that creates all kinds of problems. The other issue has been that because the EU functions as a coalition, I mean, one of the myths that keeps appearing in the British press is the idea that, it's the Germans run it, Actually, it really is a coalition, and small countries play roles, and there's a lot of horse trading, and, policies are hammered out by, these agonizing group meetings between the prime ministers that go late into the middle of the night. And there isn't a mechanism by which you can just exclude one or two countries from that coalition deal. I mean, they have votes, they have say, they have a say. And so it isn't, so I mean, I guess I'm saying two things at once. I mean, on the one hand, Poland may well be on a crash course to, to create some kind of new conflict in the near future. On the other hand, there isn't an obvious mechanism by which the EU can cope with this before it happened. And it may be, this may be one of the next really big crises. I mean, would I like the EU to find a clever and brilliant way to help democracy in Poland? Yes, I would. I would really like that. Do I see that there's some obvious thing that Ursula von der Leyen could do? No, I don't. It may be even putting conditionality into EU treaties, to do with the rule of law is going to be complicated, because then we're going to argue about what rule of law means and how you measure it. I mean, it's still my hope that over time, the example of the EU and the pull of it and the desire to be part of it, which, by the way, EU is very popular in Poland. It's still something like, it polls at like 80%. I'm hoping that the pull of sort of European civilization and European legal culture will eventually pull Poland out of this, if only through example, if not necessarily through some political mechanism.
Yeah, no, good point. On the question of information, disinformation, which you deal with, one of the questions comes from Mark. Thank you, Mark, for that question. We've got global disinformation, which you talk about. Is there any way of managing this or controlling it or pushing back on it? Or are there so many sources and so many points of entry into the discussion, which you mentioned yourself, that this becomes impossible? Is there any constitution, that it was asked, that one could draw up to manage basically social media?
So this is, as you know, this is what I was doing at the LSE, actually. And this is what my project at the Institute of Global Affairs was.
Exactly.
And the project, by the way, continues, although it's partly now moving to Johns Hopkins, where it will be expanded. But I think we may keep a foothold at the LSE as well. And we have done, together with a team of other people, we've done a lot of work on disinformation, both analyzing, what it is and how it works. And by the way, one of the ways that it works is by using these social divisions and polarization. I mean, disinformation simply works better on people who don't trust their societies and their own institutions. And we of course started by focusing on Russian disinformation, but now it's clear that the problem is much deeper than that. It's not, anybody can do what the Russians did, which is use these fake websites and trolling operations and so on. There has been some pressure put on the social media companies in recent years to find ways of controlling it. They have, it's a longer conversation. They have made some changes, but obviously not enough. It seems to me that the longer term solution, and this is what I hope to work on, or my colleagues will work on over the next few years, involves really almost stepping back and thinking about what we want the democratic internet to be. And so if the internet is now going to be the main, if it's now the public sphere, and this is where political conversation will take place, then, and by the way, the Chinese have already worked out a long time ago that this is now the political sphere, and they've set up rules that run the internet, their internet, and it's run according to, there's teams of censors, and there are words that you can't use. And there's a careful control and watch over how conversations go and so on. Okay, we don't want that system in our democracies, but what do we want? So what, other than censoring stuff we don't like and arguing about what's disinformation and what isn't, what would a positive vision of the internet look like? So is it about transparency and being able to see where things come from? Is it about transparency around the algorithms? Is there a form of public interest social media, some equivalent of some online equivalent of the BBC that is a space for conversation which is run according to rules that don't amplify emotion but amplify reason or constructive conversation. And all that, I know that all sounds a little bit far-fetched, but there is beginning to be there's sort of in several dozen places around Europe and the United States, there are beginning to be people who ask these questions, both sort of political scientists and even internet engineers who are beginning to look at those questions. I think sooner or later, we will get to the question of social media regulation, by which I do not mean censorship. I mean, a national, and maybe I hope what I would really like to see would be a kind of Western or democracy focused international conversation about what these rules could be, what works and what doesn't. How do we encourage better conversation rather than worse conversation online? And how do we better use these tools so that they benefit our political systems and they don't simply undermine and destroy them? And it's, again, a little futuristic, but there are there are a number of countries that are taking this seriously. The French take it seriously. The Germans take it seriously. And I'm hoping that over the next several years, the social media space evolves in a way that makes, as I say, better and more constructive conversation possible. And ultimately, it's not about banning disinformation. It's about favoring good information and finding ways to do that online. And that's my kind of project for the next decade. I mean,
it's a big project. I haven't brought in Russia yet, but you've obviously written about the Soviet Union in your early work. In a sense, it is the banquet at the feast, isn't it, in many ways? The Russian role in all this is known, but is it so well known? I mean, how effective do you think Russia has been under Putin in terms of exploiting these fears? Should we take it as seriously as many people seem to be? And finally, what can be done about it?
So, I mean, Russia has for the past decade been studying, contacting, helping, seeking to form these, I mean, so-called right-wing populist, but often authoritarian political parties and groupings all across Europe and actually around the world. And, ranging from, in some cases, latching on to or assisting older movements like the National Front in France, which has been around for many decades. The Russians did not invent it, but they have sought to help it, to movements where they've had a more direct role in creating them, like the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the German far-right movement. And they have sought to help, to make connections between, to do funding for all these kinds of movements. At the same time, they also seek contacts with other kinds of mainstream politicians, inside the center right and center left parties in Europe as well. But they have had a special focus on encouraging, pushing these populist, so-called populist movements, and also, by the way, far left movements. I mean, their interest was in any kinds of parties or groupings. And these vary from country to country, that would be anti-European, meaning anti-European Union, anti-NATO, some cases anti-German, anti-Ukrainian, anti-American. And they seek to push these because it's in their interest for the coalition that once was the West to break up, because the coalition is a problem for them. One-on-one, Russia is at least the equal or probably stronger than any European country. When the Russians talk to the Lithuanians by themselves, they're much bigger power. Even when they talk to the Germans, they're equals. But when they talk to the European Union is much stronger, much richer. The European Union can pass laws that prevent the Russians from using their gas pipelines, or change the regulations that prevent the Russians from using their gas pipelines, for example, to blackmail some of their neighbors, which is what they used to do in the past. And so it is in the Russian interest to break up the EU. I mean, it's not a secret. I mean, Putin has said it. And how important you think they were in those movements, a little bit depends country to country, and how much you think disinformation, money, and assistance of various kinds matters. I mean, my gut feeling about it is that in some places it mattered a lot, in some places it didn't matter that much. There's a new far right party in Spain, which I write about a little bit in the book, that I don't think had much to do with Russia. The Russians got more interested in pushing Catalan independence. That was their project in Spain. Were the Russians interested in Scottish independence? Yes, they were. And, that's been traced, even if as the recent report showed, the British government never itself analyzed that. Quite a lot of independent analysts have shown that was the case. And the reasons for that, again, are obvious. I mean, breaking up the UK would be hugely useful to Russia, which worries about the UK as a, major Western nuclear power. So the answer is the Russians are a part of this whole process, but not a small part. And how much they matter depends, does vary, but not taking it seriously, ignoring them or saying, oh, it's all a bunch of, it's just made up, is, I think, really irresponsible. And it's important to think about what role they played and continue to play.
Thank you, Anne. I think we're going to draw it to an end there, Anne. Firstly, to thank you enormously for giving up of your time. It's been great personally for me to see you again, looking so well. Welcome back to the LSE. Basically, I think you never really went away and you're still part of the LSE family. I'd also like to thank the LSE events for organizing this, and finally, to thank all those who've asked such great questions. So, Anne, been great seeing you. Keep well, keep safe, and we hope to see you again at the school in the not too distant future. Thanks again.
In real life, yes. Thank you.
In real life, the real person, not just this image at the other end. Cheers.
Thanks.